We're here to talk about Pratinav's jointly written book on the Indian emergency, India's first dictatorship, as it's called. Interestingly enough, I wondered would there be a second one, but we'll come to it. A lot of you, of course, have heard of the emergency. That's the only time when the constitution was kind of undermined in India, and it was done, of course, during Indira Gandhi's time, the Iron Lady of India to some extent. So we'll just begin from the basic premise of this because, again, a lot of people here might know something about it, but not all about it. So first, why did you pick this topic? Because, again, this is different from your PhD. So let's begin with that.
Well, it's interesting that you call her the Iron Lady of India, especially considering that the other real Iron Lady was at the same college as she did.
I know. I was Chaplain there.
Oh, well,
Imagine.
there you go. Something to do with dictatorship.
Right.
Right, this book wasn't exactly my topic, as it were, so I inherited this book. As you probably know, it's a co-authored book with a French academic, Christophe Jaffrelot. So he planned to write this book in the 1990s, and he conducted a couple of interviews, and those didn't really lead anywhere because, understandably, many Indians are squeamish discussing the emergency. It's a period of 21 months when democracy was suspended, and as you know, Indians can be quite self-congratulatory about Indian democracy and the wonderful thing that they set up in 1947, and it doesn't really look good at all to know that elections could be suspended. 100,000 people were locked up for this 21 months, all opposition parties. Well, 26 of them were banned, and all the others had no say in parliament. And well, all around, it was a terrible time to be an Indian, whether you worked for the press, whether you were a dissident, or you're just an ordinary citizen. But still, for many reasons, it was welcomed by the middle classes, and there seemed to be wide approval for it, which, again, goes on to tell you something about Indian liberalism. It's never quite what it seems, and that's pretty much the premise of our book. It's a provocative title, as you point out, India's first dictatorship. So when I wrote it, the thinking was India was moving on its way to a second dictatorship. But many readers took it to mean that we were living through India's second dictatorship. I was resistant to that comparison when the book was out in 2020, which is when Modi's second term began. But as the years have gone by and authoritarianism has really stepped up in India, I think it's perfectly fair to say, we're either just on the cusp of a second dictatorship or in this democracy's purely formalistic, in purely notional sense. And I suppose we're going to find that out in a few months' time when we have another election. Well,
So, Pratinav, let me ask you about beginning from the idea of just the even the clauses of emergency. There was a great debate when these clauses were added, and I think they were picked up from the Weimar Constitution, the emergency thing. Could you just talk a bit about just the whole social contract in a democracy is the Constitution, and if you put in a clause saying, oh well, for reason X and Y, all of this can be thrown out for a matter of months, and you can do whatever you want. Shed some light on that, because that kind of contradicts the whole process of making the whole point of having a constitution. So if you could shed light on that in the Indian context.
Well, the emergency has often been likened to the Enabling Act, which basically led to the end of the Weimar Republic and the birth of Nazi Germany. And there are many antecedents and many similarities between the emergency and other regimes. So the technical term for this is something called an auto coup, as it were, a self-coup, in that the person who's already in power decides to suspend elections. So you had something similar in the Philippines and in South Korea, and Indira Gandhi's son, Sanjay Gandhi, who became, as it were, a little Indira Gandhi, a dictator unto his own during the emergency, was rather fond of the Marcos family in the Philippines, and apparently he even had a portrait of him somewhere in his bedroom for some reason.
So,
So,
Laurent, you've
right.
kind of worked on sort of the early early parts of India, and creating this national ethos and all that. And I really want to kind of bring your work in here to really kind of, if you could comment about, do you think there was a build up to the emergency, or is it kind of a blip, or is it more of a part of the larger scheme of things which might have happened, or is it just an exception, or just something that could have just happened in any case?
It's interesting that you're asking me this question because I was just about to ask Pratinav. Yes, Pratinav, a very similar question because yesterday we discussed your other book, Another India, the making of the world's largest Muslim minority, and as we discussed it yesterday, one of your concluding remarks, more than remarks, but arguments in the book, is to say that. And that really connects the two books, that really the emergency was not an anomaly. And that's the strong argument that you're making at the end of your book, that to understand how emergency came to be, we have to understand the decades before, that we often tend to oppose to the emergency, because it's true in the nationalist historiography, to glorify the early independence period in India as an era of cultural pluralism and secularism and liberalism inspired by Nehru. And of course, much of your book, of your other book, goes against that, showing that actually there was a lot of suppression of dissent. Minorities, especially Muslims, were very much cast aside and marginalized from the political sphere, also as citizens. And so in that sense, all these elements seem to indicate that the emergency was not an anomaly, that we have to understand how all these elements came to produce the conditions that made the emergency possible. I still have a slightly different view from you about the Nehruvian period, because even though there is no doubt that we must challenge this idea that Nehruvian India was a great era of pluralism, pluralism and liberalism, I think that the fundamental difference is that the dominant discourse was still that of secular nationalism that allowed people, that allowed citizens to at least make a claim upon the state. So even though in practice there's no doubt that there was suppression of dissent and that Muslims were marginalized, at least they could make a claim upon the state in the name of secular nationalism that was the dominant discourse. And I think that's something quite important, because it does give people some degree of agency. On top of this, we have to understand that Congress was an incredibly diverse party with a lot of internal differences and factions. It is problematic in a way to call this period the Nehruvian era, because Nehru himself had actually limited power. We tend to think that Nehru, was omnipresent and, had all powers during that period. That's completely false. Just look at what was happening in Uttar Pradesh, just 100 kilometers away from Delhi, where people with a much stronger Hindu nationalist or Hindu traditionalist view were ruling UP Congress. And Nehru had actually very limited leverage over what was happening in Uttar Pradesh at the time. This is a good example of how we can't think of the Congress as a homogeneous party with a homogeneous agenda. We have to take all these internal differences into consideration. But just to go back to your question, so I think with the emergency and the suspension of rights, that constitutional framework that people could appeal to formulate their claims suddenly was no longer available. And I think that's a very significant difference. And to go back to the question of, what about today's context, I think the risk, one of the major risks that we're facing now is the question of, will there be a significant change? Will the Constitution change altogether? And in 2019 and 2020, if people, 2019 especially, when people mobilized, against the Citizenship Amendment Act, it's always in the name of the Constitution that people will protest. So it says something about how relevant the Constitution remains as discourse that people tap into to, to make a claim upon the state, to challenge the politics of the states. If the constitution changes, then I think, well, it will, we will face even greater challenges.
Well, you know, when the emergency was declared in 1975, the thinking was, hey, we're already living in an emergency. How can we possibly have a second one? And that's because we had an external emergency going back to the war with China in 1962, and that was renewed year after year. And in fact, the state of emergency doesn't begin in 1962. It really begins in 1949. So that's when Nehru decides, you know, you need to have a regime of exception to deal with recalcitrant minorities. And, you know, this is the time when both the far left and far right are banned, opposition parties are suppressed across the country. And, well, in a way, you know, you never really had much freedom in a country where the Congress controlled all the levers of power. So, and in fact, the very first amendment really goes to the heart of destroying the free press and even prevents Parliament from carrying prevents newspapers from carrying parliamentary extracts, that is, because, you know, even at the highest levels of dissent, you know, in this Parliament, you know, you aren't completely safe. So that's pretty much what democracy was. And you're quite right to emphasize that people think that the Constitution is a deeply progressive document, and today, in many senses, it's become one. It's possibly the only defense you have against Hindu nationalism, you know. If you want to show yourself as a patriotic Indian who's against the BJP, one way to say that is, hey, I defend the Indian Constitution. But that's a kind of legalism that eliminates politics entirely from the equation, you know. I mean, there's so much more to politics than the law, you know. I mean, as you point out, Nehru himself was something of an exemplary democrat, even if his regime did not quite live up to those ideals. So the basic point I'm trying to make is that the Constitution can say one thing, but it's really down to the ruling elite, the relationship with the people, how the masses react to them. In a word, politics, which is far more important than law.
Just one thing that when Laurent was talking about it, just reminded me of a couple of your articles where you used the phrase composite nation, you know. If you could talk about that, because I think, again, in trying to understand you know, the period of the emergency, that initial period of, you know, creating that composite nation, and you worked on that, will really help us understand that. So if you could talk a bit about that, I think it'll, you know, then we'll move on to some certain issues of the emergency.
So, yeah, as we all know, when nationalism emerged during the colonial period in India, there was never a single form of nationalism. There were multiple forms of nationalism that emerged. So, of course, already from the very early beginnings of nationalism, there was a strong Hindu nationalist trend. But there were also forms of secularism that tried to put less emphasis on religion and more on other argument to bring people together. And the idea of composite nationalism really developed in the late decades of the colonial period. One key author, one of the key thinkers behind the idea of composite nationalism was Hussain Ahmad Madani from the Jamiatul Ulema, who was himself an ulema, and so he wrote on Mutahida Qawmiyat, so composite nationalism, which was why did he do that? Because it was a context in the 1930s where you have an increasing tension between the Muslim League and the Congress, and the ulama who were associated with the Congress tried to find a response to the idea that, you know, well, the Lahore resolution, the Lahore discourse had not yet been made in 1940, but already at the time there was an effort to provide a conceptual framework to justify the alliance between Hindus and Muslims in the anti-colonial struggle. And that's when Madani comes up with the concept of Mutahida Qawmiyat, where basically he uses the idea of the contract between Hindus and Muslims, actually drawing inspiration from Prophet Muhammad, with the idea of the covenant, between the partnership between Jews and Muslims, to say it is perfectly possible to be two different religious groups building a political alliance to ensure our independence. Of course, the vision of independent India that he had in mind was very different from that of Nehru. The idea of independent India that he had in mind was more that of, religious groups with a very high level of autonomy who would be guided by, their religious leaders to a very large extent. And so, of course, he envisioned a very great power for ulama in independent India as guides for Muslims. And so, of course, that was a picture that was very significantly different from the kind of secular nationalism that Nehru himself was defending. But my point is to say that there were efforts to formulate, different forms of nationalism, including some that would accommodate religious differences. So it's not, and sometimes religious leaders themselves could be involved in that effort. In the post-independence period, composite nationalism is often an expression used by nationalist Muslims who are associated with the Congress to again defend the idea that Muslims are an integral part of the Indian nation and that we need to fight for a more inclusive conception of the Indian nation so that Muslims are not just, left at the margins of the nation, but that they are considered to be a core part of the Indian nation as equals to Hindus, basically.
So, Pratinav, now with... I'll just use this. So, this composite nation that's been forged for decades now gets a huge jolt in the emergency. So, what happens to the nation then? What does the emergency say about the nation that's being forged for decades by that time?
Well, obviously there is the undermining of composite nationalism in a way, because the way Sanjay Gandhi proceeds with the whole family planning drive that he orchestrates in 1975.
I think it'd be interesting to give some examples of
right,
it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a deeply Islamophobic program. So the idea is to sterilize people en masse. And of course, Hindus believe it's Muslims who are more, prolific, for want of a better word. And that's why they really go after Muslims in Delhi, in Bombay, in every city that they can find. So obviously, this idea comes under stress in 1975, which is not to say that there were no other stresses in the period before, and something we talked about yesterday. But what really changes with the emergency is the configuration of class in India. So Nehru saw himself as a bit of a socialist, this modicum of land reform that was done in the early 50s, something like 12 million acres was redistributed to the poor, which is nothing like what happened in Taiwan and Korea. Basically, the countries that went on to become the Asian tigers and had, massive investment in government programs, and that led to enormous growth. And that's the reason why so many Asian countries became fairly developed countries by the 1960s and 70s. So all of that never quite happened in India, and it comes to a full grinding halt in 1975, which is when Indira Gandhi basically declares war on the poor. So the emergency is a deeply conservative regime. So some of its biggest backers are India's leading industrialists, many of whom are still India's leading industrialists. So it's essentially a combination of, the bourgeoisie, which is to say the middle classes, the industrialists, and the rural elite who come together, put an end to the big state by paradoxically adopting a totalitarian model.
Sorry. One of the great slogans of Indira Gandhi in the 1970s was "Garibi Hatao." So how do you? And here I'm asking the question. how do you explain this gap, this apparent gap between this slogan "Garibi Hatao," which certainly allowed her to, I mean, was one of the many reasons why she became a hugely popular leader at some point of time before she was contested, and you know this deeply bourgeois regime, as you coin it.
Right, so yeah, in the early 1970s, Indira Gandhi was a populist, more or less in the same vein as Bhutto in Pakistan here. So the thinking was you need some semblance of socialism, and I suppose she had deeply cynical reasons to go about saying that. So when she became the prime minister in 1966, she was the daughter of the former prime minister who had died just 2 years earlier after ruling for 17 years. So she was basically jobbed into power by a shadowy body of Congress elites called the Syndicate. So the thinking was she would be something of a puppet, you know, a little marionette who'd do pretty much everything she was told to do. And she didn't. And one of the reasons why she managed to hold on to power was basically eliminating these rural and urban intermediaries, the party elites. So this is basically what populism means, you know, it's when elites find a language that appeals to the lower orders and brings them together into this coalition. You know, you have right populisms, the way Donald Trump represents them, and you have left populisms, which is what, well, in the US you had Bernie Sanders, and in Britain you've had Corbyn. So, well, in the 1970s you had something similar, a little populist moment in South Asia. And that's where Garibi Hatao comes in. So she managed to win an election based on that. But just fast forward 5 years, and it's an entirely different slogan she's saying. It's Bate Kam Kam Zyada, which is, you know, work less, talk less, work more. So, you know, of course, it's not a bad one, but you get the understanding. These are insufferably reactionary politics. You know, it's a world removed from Garibi Hatao, which is the language she was speaking just 4 years earlier. So she made these tall promises of reform, failed to deliver on them by 1973-74, which is when you had this extra parliamentary movement to overthrow her, the JP movement. And it came rather close to overthrowing her. So you had, you know, India's a federal country and you have states within the Indian Union. So two of them overthrew the Congress government in 1975 in the early months. And the Supreme Court had its own beef with Indira Gandhi for very good reasons, because she's trying to undermine the judiciary for the past few years. So all of this comes to a head in June 1975, which is when you get the emergency.
So, Pratinav, let's talk about Indira Gandhi, because that's the central character here. At some level, she's undoing her father, you know. At another level, she's making literally a new India. And at the third, you know, it is the first time that, you know, this has been done. Like, you know, it's unlike Pakistan, where we really have fun with declaring emergency every now and then. And we are toying with it right now also. You know, if you can speak a bit about her as a person and about, you know, what led her to just finally just say, screw it. You know, if anyone disagrees with me, or if, you know, I don't like anyone, I'll just put them in jail, which she did, you know, practically. So if you can speak about her as a person and her kind of political thinking and ideology, like you've mentioned a few bits, but more as a person, how would you characterize her?
Well, I'm basically a historian of classes and of parties and politics seen from on high. So while I typically resist talking about personalities, I think it's important to recognize that there was something about Indira Gandhi that was deeply authoritarian from the get-go. So, well, in the 1960s and 70s, you know, it was all the rage to talk about personalities, and Indira Gandhi quite fits into Theodore Adorno's idea of an authoritarian personality. You know, she used to see plots everywhere. She's essentially India's Nixon, if that's an analogy that makes sense here. So, in fact, when she becomes the party president in 1959, which is when her father's still prime minister, she decides, actually, the communists who've just been elected in Kerala, which is a state in the south of India, do not deserve to rule because they're anti-Indian. And she orchestrates their downfall through an extra parliamentary movement. So, you know, this is a good 16 years before the emergency, and you can already see authoritarianism on display. So, and it's the same logic that extends when she becomes prime minister. But I don't want to really push this personality argument too far, because there's something about the Indian premiership which is a lot like the American presidency. You know, it has its imperial aspects, and in a way, democracy has never really counted for much in India. So there's this rather influential thesis of the dominant proprietary classes and the making of Indian democracy in 1947. So while Pakistan quite, of course, struggled for 9 years to come up with a constitution, and in its first election, its first free and fair election was quite a few years away. And as we saw, it didn't end up being very free and fair. India got there very quickly. So that's not to say that democracy was entrenched very quickly. It's just that there were a number of actors, 4 of them to be precise. So you had the rural landlords, you had the industrial elites, the middle classes, and the political elites. So all of them got together. None of them were very strong to have a dictatorship in their own name. So they effectively came to a power-sharing arrangement. And that's how Indian democracy worked. So all of these classes were broadly mirrored within the Congress hierarchy, and that's how they managed to rule until the emergency. So you see, democracy was just a little carapace and a rather entirely different turtle, you know, to stretch a bizarre metaphor that it just came up with. But the basic point is, you know, it was easy to undermine democracy because, you know, its trappings were missing in India. You just had elections every 5 years, but it was a one-party state. You know, and the Congress comes to power in 47, well, 46 in the elections, and it stays in power after independence. And it stays there until 1977. So we're really talking about a one-party state here.
Don't you think that we may want to qualify this, especially if we, again, shift attention away from national level politics and shift our attention to regional level politics, because actually at regional level, the Congress was challenged from a much earlier, stage. So how do you, I mean, you know, unfortunately, I've not had the time to read your book, as you know, but in your second book, so the one on Another India, so you speak of this build-up to the emergency is essentially not an anomaly, but actually some people, including Christophe Jaffrelot, have argued that one of the key differences between India and Pakistan, and one of the reasons why democracy was more deeply rooted in India, at least for some time, was the importance of federalism and of, you know, the distribution of power between the federal government and regional governments, and that contributed to a certain degree of pluralism in the country. So I wonder to what extent, you know, you can articulate this with your argument on the state of Indian democracy in the decades that preceded the emergency.
I mean, to be sure, federalism in India has been a way of letting democracy eke out an existence, albeit on a minor level in the States. So you're quite right. A number of states elect the first non-Congress government. Well, not so early on. It's only 1967 that you have, 5 or 6 of them in a country of about 25 states at this point. So, but then again, federalism has not been able to stop authoritarianism in any way. In fact, it's enabled it because, you know, it's very easy for a party that dominates the country nationally to be able to put its own puppets in place. So Nehru, of course, struggled for a very long time in reining in his chief ministers, some of whom were Hindu nationalists, like in Uttar Pradesh, and they're the ones that fired Muslims en masse and basically made trouble for everyone who didn't broadly fit into the Congress type, as it were. But by the early 1970s, the entire relationship between the states of the Union and the federal government in Delhi is entirely reversed. So Indira Gandhi's putting many Indira Gandhis in power across the country. And they're pretty much saying the same things as her. And this is why her policies and programs can spread so quickly across the country in the span of a few months. So the sheer damage that could be done during the emergency really owed to her ability to diffuse her programs rather well. Though, of course, there are caveats to that. Parts of South India did not see the emergency in quite the same way, that you did in the north. Well,
I mean, maybe that this is a really interesting point. You know, there's this difference between the impact of emergency in northern India and southern India, and maybe you may want to come back to this. But I had another question in mind first. In one of your earlier answers, you spoke of the JP movement, and actually, I think that's extremely important because we often think of political history in terms of parties, but of course, social movements can also be incredibly important. I wanted to ask you, can you tell us more about the trajectory, if I may say, of social movements just before and then during the emergency and also after? Because actually many people who were in the opposition to Indira Gandhi and were sometimes sanctioned during the emergency then became major political or social movement leaders after the emergency, including some BJP leaders. So can you tell us more about the trajectory of social movements and how the emergency had an impact on this trajectory?
well, yeah, I think there's a very good reason we don't talk about social movements in the Indian setting very much, because, to be honest, there've just been a handful of them in the last 75 years. I mean, the JP movement was the first time a non-party force became something really big in a nationwide way in 1974. You had a bit of that in the 1980s and 90s, around the whole Babri Masjid affair, when Hindu nationalists tried to flatten a mosque, and eventually did in 1992. And then again, you had a brief moment in the 2010s with an anti-corruption movement that ended up being tremendously successful, and one could say played a rather big role in facilitating Modi's rise and certainly rehabilitating him after the 2002 riots, in which he was at least criminally negligent, if not directly complicit. So in Italy, they call the country a partitocrazia, a partocracy, effectively, which is to say politics is just the realm of political parties. The people tend to be deeply conservative and they don't really care very much about politics. And I think that's very true of India. I mean, I never quite bought the whole Amartya Sen argument about argumentative Indians. I mean, we are a deeply quiescent people, and if given a chance, we don't really participate in politics at all. So if you look at vote shares in the 1950s and 60s, they're appallingly low. They rise by the 1980s on account of the rise of the subalterns, but overwhelmingly, most Indians, and 4 in 5 Indians during the emergency lived in the countryside, really have no idea of high politics. So, in 1976, there's a British anthropologist who was working in rural Maharashtra, which is a state in Western India where Bombay is. And he asked a number of people, what do you think of the emergency? And they had absolutely no idea. They thought the British were in power, or maybe Nehru was, or maybe Gandhi was. So, we're talking about a society that was deeply illiterate to begin with, and in many senses ambivalent to politics completely. And then when he explained what the emergency was, what authoritarianism was, Hukum Shahi in Marathi, they said, actually, that doesn't sound like a bad idea, Maybe we need more strong people to do things and shake things up.
So, Pratinav, just on that, and I really did want to ask, when the emergency happens, a lot of us say, "Oh, it was a bad thing," or "Ye hua, wo hua," all of that, and it's we all know okay, people got jailed and yes, sab kuch hua, but it was still hugely popular. A lot of people really did like it, and I think that's a very interesting thing to talk. That was not the case. Not everyone hated it. So if you could talk about how people viewed it, again, in different parts of India, you were mentioning earlier also that there's a difference between the north and the south, but also about how people just even view the idea of it. Because a lot of the times, and this is very typical with Pakistan, every single time there's been a military takeover here, it is celebrated. Every single time. And then in a few years, we're like, well, actually, we don't like the guy. At least in a democracy, you can, change the guy, but, the chief, you can't really change. So was it kind of something similar that people, some people might, and of course, it was the case that some people might thought, oh, wow, this is a strong woman, she's putting her foot down. So what was the reaction of the people? What did they think about this happening? And we know the political opponents, of course, didn't like it, being ending up in jail, but just the normal public.
Well, so the emergency comes about in 1975, and you need to put that in world historical context here. So, in 1973, you have the oil shock, the Nixon shock, and oil prices go up by 400%. And, very quickly, like, a stack of cards coming crashing down. Democracies collapse across Asia, by the end of the 70s, you have dictatorships in many places. So, India is just one country in a broad move. So what's happening here is, prices are at an all-time high, inflation's running at 20%. I get it. It probably sounds tone deaf saying this in Pakistan today, but 20% was a great deal when people were used to 4 or 5% earlier. And industrial relations has completely crumbled. You had something like 40 million man days lost to strikes every day. So, you could go outside your home, wait for your bus, and your bus would never show because people were on strike. So you can see there's a lot of frustration that things not working out at all. So especially among the middle classes, this whole authoritarian business came across as something really nice. The strikes came to an end immediately. So people welcomed it, as indeed people welcome military dictatorships here, because it ends the morass of corruption and all the trouble that countries are facing. But when you start to look deeper down, strikes continue during the emergency, but these are not strikes, but lockouts, which is to say bosses are locking out workers. So these are the strikes of the industrial bosses rather than of their workers. So while the number of strike days falls to 6 million, the number of days lost to lockouts rises to 9 million. So you see who's got the upper hand now. You could say broadly the working classes had the upper hand in 1973 and 1974, and then it's the Tatars and Birlas by 1977. So, and that's all down to the emergency and how conservative it was. So it was deeply unpopular by that point. So the middle classes came and said, okay, Indira Gandhi's great, we're going to vote for her. But the working classes deserted her en masse. And this is the first time the Congress loses power in the country in 1977. And one may say if there was no emergency, well, Hindu nationalism would have never been legitimized as this great force in the opposition. The Congress could have possibly ruled for another 50 years, and Indian history would look entirely different today. So you see, in 19 months, Indira Gandhi managed to end a party that had been a relatively successful operation since 1885. So
I just wanted to.
That's down to the emergency.
Yeah, I just want to sort of ask that question, and then we'll open up for some comments. But you mentioned, of course, the first, end reaction of the 19 months is that the Congress for the first time loses power. Great. What do you think are the long-term kind of impact of this 19-month period on the rest of Indian history as it happened afterwards? Do you think it changed the way India operated politically or even socially to some extent afterwards? Or was this emergency, again, as you were saying, was the rise of Hindutva inevitable? If it even weren't for the emergency, there would have been something else. Or do you think the emergency fundamentally changed a few things in how Indian politics works?
Right, so I like to say that the emergency was a concentrate of a style of rule that's been in India for a very long time. So, it's obviously a lot worse than anything that came before or after it, but they're continuities. But it certainly had an enabling function. Now, if we just take a single figure like Narendra Modi today, he cuts his teeth in the emergency, he dresses himself like a Sikh, goes abroad, all his mates are languishing in prison. And, this is what he sees to be Indian democracy. He thinks these are the rules of the game, you can lock up members of the opposition if they start acting funny. And, he broadly conforms to the same political type as Indira Gandhi. And I think a lot of that has to do with those formative years he spent in the 1970s as a 20-something. And well, coming to his mates in prison, that's the first time the Jansang, which is the Hindu Nationalist Party in India at this point, the predecessor to the BJP, which was formed in 1980, is in prison with people from all other ends of the political spectrum. So they meet the likes of Charan Singh, who's the leader of the Indian kulaks, broadly, the upper peasantry, people who own between 5 to 15 acres of land, the types that benefited from the Green Revolution. He's, in cahoots with socialists. He meets all kinds of people. So all the Hindu nationalists before that were completely stigmatized. They're treated like the devil. You don't want to do business with them. These are the guys that killed Gandhi in 1948. They're bad for business. They're going to spell the ruin of India. But when they're all locked up together, suddenly they realize more unites them than divides them. And that's how you actually defeat the Congress in 1977. So it bestows a certain legitimacy to Hindu nationalism. They get a number of portfolios, education included, in 1977, and they can start rewriting textbooks, and they can work their ways in a less insidious fashion than they needed to. And very quickly they double and treble in size, and by the 1980s they're a force to be reckoned with, and by the 1990s, they clean up their act on foreign investment and nuclear weapons, throw in a bit of socialism in the mix, and hey, they're in power by 1996. So I think the emergency plays a very big role in legitimizing another kind of politics, and that kind need not be a progressive one, which to a very small extent the JP movement was before it disappeared.
Yeah, some questions, comments?
Yeah, question.
Yes.
Yeah. So you are referring that.
सर माइक ले ले रिकॉर्डिंग के लिए चाहिए. One second.
Yeah, just that. Yeah.
Gigi.
So you are referring that the Indian emergency was the reason that that the Jansan got actually mainstreamed, but in the 1984 elections they had got only 2 seats. So preferably, I think that it was the Rajiv Gandhi period that actually they got the momentum and they got the popular swell. So that was one comment, because certainly, as you are saying that so I am trying to say is that the fundamental thing was for us, for me to understand from you especially, is that how come that Indira Gandhi realized that she can't prolong this emergency thing for a longer period of time, and she ultimately has to go back to her democratic roots, knowing that the people will not elect her. And the first thing in 1977, when they rolled back the emergency, and the second thing, that how come the people so quickly realized that they need to forgive Indira Gandhi for emergency and re-elect her in 1980. So this period of how people relate to emergency, because right now we are thinking about emergency 35 years ago. Those people who had very freshest of the memories in 1980s re-elected her in a very popular vote. So these are the questions.
Right, so far as I can tell, the 3 questions there. So coming to 1984 to begin with, that was a rather special election because it follows what was... Well, yeah, I'm not that funny, really. Well, so in 1984, you have a very special election because it follows on the wake of, a pogrom against Sikhs and the assassination of Indira Gandhi. So, there's a lot of sympathy already, weighing in for her son. And more importantly, the RSS decides, the Hindu nationalist organization behind the BJP decides to back the Congress because, they say Mr. Gandhi as their man, effectively. So it's not to say that Hindu nationalism disappears in 84. It just finds another outlet, which just happens to be the Congress candidate at that point because, he's seen as the face of anti-Sikhism, of the real Hindu son of the soil. So, in 1980, the Hindu nationalists are pretty strong, and they're not voting Indira Gandhi. They still have their own party, and much the same in 77. So, 84, that election result can't be read as, the end of Hindu nationalism in any way. It's a very strong current. This is the Babri Masjid era. You have Hindu epics being screened on television. This is Hindu revival sentiment that's floating in some kind of deep undercurrent in society. So Indira Gandhi's hubris in 1977, you say she knew she was going to lose. Not so. You can look at any of her memoirs, any of the memoirs of any of the people who worked under her. She's extremely confident that she'll win. The thinking was, these were the bad guys. We shut them up. We changed the judges. We put the JP movement down. We brought inflation under control. All's good. We're going to win. So that was the thinking going into the election. And coming to the 1980 election, so there's 3 years in which a coalition of 5 parties ruled. They didn't really change any policies on the ground. So, the sterilization of the working classes in the name of family planning continues. The demolition of their homes in the name of gentrification, or beautification as they call it in the Indian setting, continues. And as do most of the policies. So it's very easy for Indira Gandhi to come back and say, hey, actually, these guys are completely chaotic. And, right. Questions?
You suggested at some point of time that we tend to assume that Indians were interested in democracy, but actually many were not. But actually, don't you think that the 1977 defeat of the Congress actually goes against your argument, in the sense that, in spite of the fact that Indira Gandhi was able to control inflation, people still voted against her in massive numbers?
Oh, well, you have a point, but just to put the figures in perspective, her vote share is something like 40%, and then it falls to 32, I mean, she does alienate 8% of India's population. But when I was making the point about democracy, I wasn't thinking of it purely in procedural electoral terms, What I was trying to say is, if, your prime minister suddenly decides we don't want democracy, we're going to suspend elections, you'd expect to see millions of people pouring out on the streets and saying, what's going on? We need to put an end to this, And you saw none of that, The next day people just went to work as if nothing had changed at all. That's what I mean by people not caring about democracy. Okay, election time, the fishes and loaves of office, there are 100 other things going on. But when it comes to aspects that are not purely procedural, when it's the free press, when it's someone getting ideas above their station just because they happen to be the prime minister of the country, people are fine with that. Because at the end of the day, hierarchy is deeply imbued in the Indian setting. And, we can speak for hours about the caste system here, but the question is, people are fine with elites getting a bit nasty.
Well, let's end from where we began. It was the first dictatorship. Was, she declared an emergency.
Well, I don't think Modi needs to at this point, because he's so damn popular. He's just been moving from strength to strength. In the 2014 election, he gets 30%, and then he pushes it up to 37%, and it's very likely to grow now. So I suppose, again, Modi's part of a broader wave here of illiberal democracy across the world. So this is the way it's going to be. No one's going to, have a dictatorship completely. Well, I suppose people are all too familiar with the establishment maneuvering things from behind. And that's pretty much what's happening in India today. You don't need to say we don't need elections. You can just shut everyone else up, go through the motions of an election and carry on.
When you were also, just the last thing, right. I just thought might as well ask that. When you were working with this on this book with Christophe, did anything shock you that you learned through the book, through working on the book, or was it more or less kind of an expected version of emergency, or were they like those moments where you were surprised at anyone's reaction or at way people react to things or understood things?
I must say, I began the book as somewhat of a centrist liberal, if I may. So, I broadly bought the myth of how great Indian democracy was, and pretty much everything I read was an eye-opener. So the archive I depended on was a constitutional historian, Granville Austin's bequest. So these are thousands and thousands of pages of testimony about what happened during the emergency years. So they're shocking instances of torture, of political of everyone really across the country. So it's a really nasty, gruesome stuff you're reading in the archives out there. So obviously that was the angle I was coming at it initially, but the more I read about the periods bookending the emergency, I noticed many of these policies actually have a much longer history, both before and after. So that's when I started to think, maybe focusing too much on the emergency is not going to tell you very much about India. You have to look at Indian democracy in the longue durée.
Well, there's one comment.
I as we know in this discussion, there isn't any difference between Indira Gandhi and the Modi. The same dictatorship feature, but in different color. So today, the Modi era is the same as we had in Indira Gandhi.
That's correct.
Actually, there isn't that difference.
Well, not substantively, maybe Hindu nationalism, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for it, Pratinav. And I think it's a and I think one of the main things of the book, of course, is that it's just not that 19-month period. It has a longer history, and a lot of those things still continue, not just in India, but in Pakistan and other countries. So treating that as an exception is actually not understanding India well in that sense. So thank you very much for this, and I hope that our listeners also kind of enjoyed this, and thank you, Laurent, for stepping in. I hope we have done Pippa's like some we've been not too bad replacements, but thank you so much, and over to the last session now. Thank you.
And my apologies for running over time.